viewers, my name's Cara. I wanted to do just a simple kind of video today, and I've decided to talk about a couple of things that a lot of us in the Northern Hemisphere don't always think about as far as the differences in magical practice, basic stuff, mind you, between the two hemispheres. I live in the Northern Hemisphere. I've never even been to the Southern Hemisphere, so I certainly can't tell you all of the different nuances and intricacies that a lot of our friends who might be from the Southern Hemisphere could tell you. There are, of course, lots of Southern Hemisphere pagans here on YouTube and in the blogosphere and things like that as well. They can tell you a lot more than I can, but I just want to talk about some basic stuff that a lot of you might already know, but there are always new people finding these videos and coming into learning about paganism, neo-paganism, witchcraft, things like that. So this might be useful for someone who finds this video earlier on in their journey. Or I've also noticed just through talking about it a little bit that a lot of us in the Northern Hemisphere may have just not come across this information yet or ever thought about it before. So even though it might seem kind of basic to some of us, it might be brand new information for other people. So firstly, I want to talk about the sun. We're going to talk about some things with the sun and the moon. And the biggest thing is actually this. So we might have seen this word if you've already done some reading about neo-paganism, witchcraft, specifically anything that might be Wicca based. You might have seen this word. Deosil is the most popular spelling, although it's not necessarily the most accurate. So you might have also seen DEASIL, you might have seen DEISUL, anything like that. And I was always told that it was pronounced Jessel, although after looking online to see more pronunciations, I have learned that some people do actually pronounce it Deosil, or a variety of other pronunciations. So I've always pronounced it Jessel. And what that word means, it comes from Gaelic, Scottish in particular, I believe. What that word actually means is sunwise, or in the direction of the sun. So basically, the apparent direction that the sun travels relative to us. Since the word came from the Northern Hemisphere, it's kind of Northern Hemisphere centric. So that's where I'm going to start talking about it, and then we'll talk about how it relates to the Southern Hemisphere. So the sun rises in the east, it travels along at its height, it is further to our south because the equator is to our south if we're in the Northern Hemisphere, and then it sets in the west. So as we are looking at it, if we were standing facing the east, the sun would be rising, and then it would move sort of over our right shoulder as it goes closer to the equator, closer to the south. So sunwise, or moving sunwise, when you're in the Northern Hemisphere, means sort of turning to the right, to over your right shoulder, or the right hand side. And this also has to do with, there were traditions in other religions as well. It's not just pagan-based religions, but, well, I guess that depends on your definition of pagan. But essentially, there are different cultures and traditions where it is considered fortuitous or better luck, etc., to keep things on your right-hand side. And so I was doing a little bit of extra reading today just to make sure I have my facts behind this straight. And I read a bit about how there tends to be a right-hand bias in a lot of cultures as well, so it might have come out of that. But that it's considered good luck to keep things on your right-hand side. So when doing a circle, so I think it was Wikipedia mentioned that the Druids would do their circles of their sacred space going sunwise, or circling to the right in this sort of direction. Because as you are doing that, you would keep your sacred space, your temple, whatever the sort of central focus is that you are going around, you would keep it on your right-hand side. So this all kind of goes together. Of course, in the Southern Hemisphere, however, the apparent motion of the sun is different. So in the Southern Hemisphere, the sun rises in the east, but then it moves more to the north because the equator is to the north and then sets that way. So moving sunwise in the southern hemisphere is actually opposite of moving sunwise in the northern hemisphere. The opposite of sunwise, or the opposite of Jessel, or however you pronounce that, we call that, oh, I wrote this way too big, it's not going to fit here. We call that widdershins, or any other types of pronunciations. This comes from Germanic, so there are definitely more Germanic sounding pronunciations of that. And as I was reading today to remind myself, widder, that part of it means like against or opposite, and then the shins part comes from actually like sin or sinnig or other words like that, referring to the journey or the way or the path, things like that. So basically, widdershins means going against the usual way, against the normal way, which would be sunwise. That was considered the most fortuitous way. So in some cultures and traditions, widdershins is considered bad luck or less fortunate or whatever. So when I was first learning about paganism, witchcraft, all this kind of stuff, the sources that I was reading about a decade ago, right, very different than the sources we have now. And I remember reading in some of them, at least, that like widdershins is bad luck and you should never cast your circle widdershins and stuff like that. So a lot of modern pagan paths do follow this idea that moving sunwise is the direction that we want to go. It's considered the best or whatever. It's following the motion of the sun is building up energy. That's how we add energy to what we're doing. That's how we draw things to us. It's how we manifest things. So when you cast your circle at the full moon, you're most likely casting it moving to the right, or what we consider sunwise. But the interesting thing to remember is, of course, if you have friends in the southern hemisphere, sunwise to them is turning over the left shoulder. So we in the northern hemisphere, we tend to think everything's about us. So we think that sunwise automatically means clockwise, right? So actually, I erased sunwise, I shouldn't have. But clockwise in the northern hemisphere came about because of sundials being used to tell the time. So the clock face was made based on how, that's not how a clock looks. Oh my gosh, what am I doing right now? The clock face was made based on how the motion of the sun moves across the sundial. So here's my clock face. It's not exactly circular, but that's okay. So if we were standing in the center, facing whatever direction, we would be moving to our right, following the direction that the hours proceed around the clock face. That's clockwise or sunwise in the northern hemisphere. But in the southern hemisphere, you'd be going the other way to follow the motion of the sun. So it would look like they're going counterclockwise, which we in the northern hemisphere think of as widdershins. We might think of that as being bad luck. And so we might hear people talk about casting their circle a different direction, and you might be like, what are you doing? Like, that's not how you're supposed to do it, or whatever, or that's wrong, or whatever you've been taught. And that's what I thought when I was like 12 years old and first starting to learn about these things, because I had read like, oh, you never do that. Of course, now I know there are instances, even in the northern hemisphere, there are instances where we might want to cast our circle widdershins. And so I am much less afraid of the supposed bad luck superstition that comes with it. So we might think of moving with the direction of the sun, as I said, as growing energy, as drawing things to us, as manifesting. And then we might think of going anti-sunwise, which in the northern hemisphere does correspond to anti-clockwise on a clock face, but is opposite in the southern hemisphere. We might think of going anti-sunwise or widdershins as moving things away from us or banishing things like that. So instead of thinking like good luck, bad luck, we might think in terms of drawing in and pushing away, manifesting, banishing, things like that. So there are definitely reasons that I, as a practitioner in the Northern Hemisphere, do cast circles, what we would call widdershins or anti-sunwise in the Northern Hemisphere. But of course, in the Southern Hemisphere, they're switched. So what we look at and say sunwise is anti-sunwise or widdershins in the Southern Hemisphere, and vice versa. So I just think that's something interesting to think about, that I see a lot of people online talking about like trying to help educate new people and telling them like, you must always do this clockwise, or never do things anti-clockwise, or counterclockwise is another thing that we say. But they're not adding in that is only dependent on the direction of the sun in the Northern Hemisphere. And when we're online and we're just posting things on the internet for people to make use of, you don't know where people live. So there might be people reading that who are in the Southern Hemisphere or who live along the equator, which is a completely different experience that, again, I can't speak to. But there definitely are pagans and witches on the internet who either live in or are from, or sometimes live in or visit areas right along the equator, and they can tell you more about how that works when you're right along that line and the sun is directly above you instead of slightly to the north or slightly to south. What do you do, right? We could also talk about the directions and the elements and how that changes from northern to southern hemisphere, or even just depending on the country, the location that you're in, anywhere around the world, the elements that you associate with the different cardinal directions could be totally different. But that's a totally different video. We could talk about stuff like that forever. But yeah, I just wanted to focus on the sun thing and then one little thing about the moon as well, because I see people, like I said, just posting things online trying to help people out, but we're saying clockwise and counterclockwise, not mentioning the fact that that really only applies in the northern hemisphere. If you're in the southern hemisphere, it might be the opposite. And so if people are saying never do it counterclockwise, well, that might actually be the direction you want to use in the southern hemisphere if you want to go sunwise. And there are also other traditions around the world. I don't know how to pronounce this. I tried to look it up, but I didn't find a good pronunciation. But there is another Tibetan religion. Bon or Bonpo are the words that I saw. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. I don't know that much about it, but I was just reading that they traditionally cast their circles anti-sunwise or widdershins, and that's kind of always been the case. And so I read a little bit on Wikipedia that said a practitioner of that religion in the southern hemisphere would simply have to decide for themselves, is it more important the directionality of keeping things on the right-hand side versus keeping things on your left-hand side as you're walking around them? Or is it more important for them to go either with or against the apparent direction of the movement of the sun? So I think the same thing applies to us. If what's most important to you is the right-hand side versus left-hand side directionality, then you might just only talk about clockwise and counterclockwise. Even if you go to the southern hemisphere, if it's most important to you to keep something on your right-hand side, you might always do something clockwise, going over your right shoulder. But if what's important to you is to go with the direction of the sun, as it might be if you consider yourself an earth-based practitioner or someone who is trying to practice in tune with the rhythms of nature, the sun, the moon, all these kinds of things, then going with or against the direction of the sun might be what's most important to you. And so that's just what I want to remind people, is that if we're talking about the direction in relation to the motion of the sun, we should actually be saying sunwise, not clockwise, because that differs whether you're in the northern or southern hemisphere. And Jessel, or however you want to pronounce it, means sunwise. So an easier way to say it, if we're not sure how to pronounce it, we could just say sunwise, anti-sunwise, or Jessel, widdershins, whatever. So there's that. And then the thing that I wanted to mention about the moon is just kind of the same thing. So again, starting with the northern hemisphere, you have probably seen a symbol that looks like this. This is the triple moon symbol, or sometimes we call it the triple goddess, the triple moon goddess symbol, whatever. It can be used as a mnemonic device to remember which way how the moon looks during different phases, which way is waxing versus waning. So in the northern hemisphere, if you look at this symbol and you read it from left to right, how we traditionally read English, the Latin alphabet, you start here with waxing on the left, so the crescent moon curving to the right is the waxing moon, and then of course we have the full moon here, and then the one on the right curving to the left is the waning moon. So this had been helpful to me in the past 10 years, trying to remember, like, if you're looking at the moon and you're like, which direction is that? Okay, well, in the triple moon, this way is waxing, this way is waning, because we're reading it left to right. Then that has helped me before. So if you didn't know that, that's a little mnemonic device, but this is only applicable to the northern hemisphere. In the southern hemisphere, you either have to read it right to left, because the way that the moon appears south of the equator is opposite to how it appears north of the equator. So you either have to read it right to left, or you would actually draw it more like this. Waxing, full, oops, hang on, there we go, waxing, like this, waxing, full, waning. So you can actually draw it like that or type it out like that, and most people think, oh, well, it doesn't really look the same, it doesn't really look as cool or whatever, so they don't do it that way. But this is how it would be if you're reading it left to right, how the moon appears south of the equator. The waxing moon curves this way, full moon, of course, is the full moon, and the waning moon curves that way, so they appear opposite on opposite sides of the equator as well. And another thing we could do is actually draw it with the dark moon in the center, so just give me a second here to do that. So the waxing moon would be like that. This is, yeah, yep, waning. It's so funny, I actually have to do that, yeah. So you could actually draw it like this, which I've seen some people draw it with the dark moon and the dark parts of the crescents, which means that that would actually be depicting a gibbous moon where the rest of it is illuminated. And this would be the waxing and this would be the waning. And by habit, I labeled it as it would be in the northern hemisphere. It would be waxing to waning, left to right, in the southern hemisphere. But yeah, so the direction of the sun is opposite on opposite sides of the equator, so is the direction of the moon. And meanwhile, like, I won't go too in depth with this, but this is another really basic thing that most of you who have already been practicing for a while will already know, but again, if anybody's watching this who's brand new to it, they might not know. The Sabbats, also because of axial tilt and all of that, the seasons are actually opposite on the other side of the equator. I don't know if some people might not know that or just have never thought of it if you don't know anyone in the southern hemisphere and you live in the northern hemisphere. And so because the seasons are opposite, the Sabbat celebrations, which are based on the seasons, not on the man-made calendar, are also opposite in the southern hemisphere. So when we are celebrating the summer solstice in the northern hemisphere, that is in June. So we might think of June as being summer, but in the southern hemisphere, that is their winter solstice in the middle of June. When we have winter solstice in December in the northern hemisphere, which is also where the date of Christmas is, December, so we think of December as being the winter holiday time. In the southern hemisphere, that's the middle of summer. So their winter solstice takes place 6 months out from Christmas. Similarly, we have Samhain, or Halloween, at the end of October in the Northern Hemisphere, while the Southern Hemisphere is celebrating Beltane. And when we are celebrating Beltane in May, they are celebrating Samhain. So also, when the Southern Hemisphere has Samhain, which is an autumn festival, it's nowhere near the secular calendar date of Halloween being on October 31st. So this is another thing that I think, I should have been drawing this out as I was talking, but spring equinox, autumn equinox, I'll just start with those 4. Yeah. So when it's winter solstice here, it's summer solstice in the Southern Hemisphere. When it's the autumn equinox here, it's the spring equinox or vernal equinox. I usually say vernal equinox, but I thought spring just then. The vernal equinox in the Southern Hemisphere. So they're all opposite. And then in here as well, we have, like, this is where Imbolc would be, and Lammas. So when we are celebrating Imbolc in the north, it's Lammas in the south. And same with, then this is Beltane and Samhain. And these are all Celtic-based names as well. So if your path isn't Celtic or your own culture isn't Celtic-based, you might not use these names. So these are just some of the more well-known names. Not everyone uses these. And the reason I did want to bring this up actually real quick right here at the end is that I have some friends in the Southern Hemisphere, and I was talking to someone, and they said that they still have people commenting to them, like during the Sabbats, when we're posting about a certain Sabbat in the Northern Hemisphere, like we're coming up on the autumn equinox soon, so it's coming up on the vernal equinox or the spring equinox in the Southern Hemisphere. There have been some people, again, on the internet, we don't know these things yet, and we don't necessarily know where people are from on the internet unless it says it right there in their bio, or we already know them or whatever. So there have been some instances of people trying to correct practitioners in the Southern Hemisphere, telling them, that's the wrong Sabbat, that's not actually what we're celebrating right now. And it's actually because that person doesn't realize they're speaking to someone on the opposite side of the globe in a different hemisphere, where they are in fact celebrating a different season, because the seasons are opposite. So this all, for me, connects because my path is earth-based and nature-based. That might not be the case for everyone, but if our paths are based in the cycles of nature, then the thing that matters the most is actually the seasons, not the man-made calendar. So, it's about summer as a season. It's not about June, July, August on the secular calendar, Summer doesn't take place in June, July, and August everywhere on the planet. Similarly, the direction of the sun, sunwise and anti-sunwise. It's about the direction that the sun moves relative to where you happen to be on the planet at the time. It's not about what it looks like on a clock face, which is always the same. So to me, I don't like saying clockwise and counterclockwise because it's not the same everywhere on the planet. For me, it's about the direction of the sun, so I prefer sunwise. And then just a little bit about the moon is just kind of a reminder. Sometimes you might see people, so we can type it with parentheses, 0 or capital O, and then other parentheses, so you can like write the triple moon symbol with a keyboard. And you might see people do it this way, and you might be tempted to think, like, what is that? Or that's wrong, or like, what were they trying to do? Is that like an egg or whatever? And it might just be someone doing the moon phase symbols from how they look in the Southern Hemisphere, So there are just some little things that we might not have thought of, we might not be aware of if we live in the Northern Hemisphere, because so many of the books that have been available over the past decade are written in the Northern Hemisphere. They're based in how everything is from a Northern Hemisphere perspective. And now we're seeing more and more books becoming more widely available to everyone that were written by people who live in the Southern Hemisphere. And so these perspectives are becoming more readily available to people in the Northern Hemisphere. So even if you don't have friends who live in the Southern Hemisphere, maybe you're starting to see some of this information. So yeah, I thought that would be a nice, easy, low-tech with the whiteboard video to do for everyone this week. And big shout out to all of my Southern Hemisphere friends, all of our Southern Hemisphere witches, pagans, etc., practitioners of magic, whatever, and also just anyone else who happens to tune in from the Southern Hemisphere. Let us know anything else in the comments if you're from the Southern Hemisphere, if there's anything else that you can think of that maybe people should know from the get-go. Like I said, you could talk about the directions and how they relate to the elements differently in different places on the planet. That could be its own video for sure. There's so much to say about that. But yeah, I just thought a couple little basic things about the sun and the moon and the nature cycles, the seasons, and how the Sabbats are different, things like that would be just something nice to share that maybe not everyone is aware of. Or again, if you're finding this video earlier on in your practice, hopefully that helps you out a little bit. So I'll see you next time. Feel free to share anything in the comments if you like. Thanks so much for watching and listening. Don't forget to be awesome, blessed be, and goodbye.